Spider-Man has one of the wildest multiverses in comics, but not every variant was a brilliant reinvention. Across alternate realities, timelines, and experimental stories, Marvel created versions of Peter Parker and other spider heroes with bizarre origins, questionable powers, or concepts that pushed the character too far. Some were fascinating experiments, while others felt unnecessary, confusing, or completely disconnected from what makes Spider-Man work. They may have looked interesting on paper, but their execution left plenty of fans scratching their heads. But which Spider-Man variants went too far? Here are 10 Spider-Man variants that never should have happened. At number 10 is Spider-Man of Earth-11580. Debuting in Spider-Geddon issue 3 before getting an origin prelude in Vault of Spiders, Marvel's Spider-Man of Earth-11580 was a nightmarish, high-concept gimmick designed strictly to stand out on crowded comic shelves. Instead of gaining spider powers, this Peter Parker fell into a radioactive colony that devoured his flesh, absorbed his consciousness, and animated his empty costume as a writhing hive mind swarm. This execution completely shattered the core ethos of the character. Rather than wrestling with responsibility, Spider-Man became a psychopathic vigilante who casually ate street criminals alive. The narrative quickly devolved into unreadable body horror, dwelling on arachnids spilling from eye holes to rip human flesh apart. Though he managed to hide his gruesome hunger for human flesh from the superior spider army, Marvel realized this grotesque print experiment offered zero long-term narrative utility, unceremoniously exiling the swarm to background gag panels before quietly abandoning it completely. At number 9 spot is Peter Parkedcar, or the Spider-Mobile of Earth-53913. During Dan Slott's original 2014 to 2015 Spider-Verse crossover, Marvel mandated that every conceivable iteration of the brand become a canonical totem, leading to the literal canonization of a notorious 1970s merchandising blunder. Introduced in Amazing Spider-Man Volume 3, Issue 12, Earth-53931 imagined an anthropomorphic universe where the hero is Peter Parkedcar, a sentient dune buggy with headlights for eyes. While intended as a fleeting, self-aware joke, the editorial inexplicably treated the vehicle as a legitimate combatant in a high-stakes cosmic war. Having a cartoon car exchange tactical dialogue with grim, battle-hardened survivors, while interdimensional vampires slaughtered beloved icons, utterly destroyed the dramatic tension of the main event book. This absurdity epitomized the quantity over quality mandate of the era. In the end, the concept proved useless beyond a quick laugh. The buggy was swiftly reduced to an uncredited background asset, serving as an enduring reminder of executives treating flagship storylines like cheap toy commercials. At number 8 is Spider-Man or May Parker of Earth-31213. Originally conceived by writer Steve Skeets and artist Alan Kupperberg in 1980s. What If issue 23? As a lighthearted alternative where Aunt May visits a science exhibit to deliver Peter's forgotten lunch and gets bitten, Marvel resurrected the character for 2015's Spider-Verse Team-Up issue 3. This corporate decision was pure nostalgia baiting, designed to cash in on obscure Bronze Age trivia and fuel multi-cover variant sales. But what worked perfectly well as a brief 8-page parody severely curdled when forcefully inserted into a grim modern continuity. Watching an elderly woman fight terrifying multiversal predators using raw dough and knitting needles, while countless other versions of her beloved nephew were being brutally drained of their life energy, created an irreconcilable tonal disconnect. The character served no real narrative purpose other than artificially padding out tie-in trade paperbacks. Following the event's conclusion, editorial rapidly shelved Earth-3123, cementing her legacy as a frustrating artifact of relentless crossover bloat. Up next, we uncover a deranged high school predator who pushes body horror to its absolute limit, alongside an edgy, post-apocalyptic crime boss that Marvel couldn't even legally print on a toy box. You will not want to look away, as we also expose a despotic Green Goblin identity crisis and the infamous dystopian graphic novel that permanently ruined Peter Parker's biology. At number 7 is Patton Parnell of Earth-51412. Published in 2014's Edge of Spider-Verse issue 4 by Clay McLeod Chapman and Elia Bonetti, Earth-51412 represented an aggressive attempt to fuse standard origin tropes with extreme David Cronenberg-style body horror. The creative brief sought to explore what happens when an unhinged sociopath gains arachnid abilities instead of a well-meaning kid from Queens. However, the execution completely abandoned any thematic resonance, delivering a profoundly ugly shock comic. Patton is introduced dissecting neighborhood animals before his mutation turns him into a multi-fanged, eight-eyed monster. In a deeply uncomfortable sequence, he eats his abusive uncle alive, stalks his classmate Sarah Jane, and implants live eggs beneath her skin. This version was so thoroughly revolting and out of step with the wider franchise that writers had the villain Morlun rip off his arm and mandible before draining his life force on the final page. By executing the protagonist within 22 pages of his debut, Marvel rendered the entire exercise a pointless experiment in try-hard edginess. At number 6 is Ashley Barton, or Spider-Bitch of Earth-807-128. Debuting in Mark Millar and Steve McNiven's critically acclaimed Wolverine, Volume 3, Issue 67 in 2008, Ashley Barton entered the bleak old man Logan wasteland as the estranged daughter of Hawkeye and Tanya Parker. Embodying the sheer excess of late 2000s grimdark publishing, she adopted a highly vulgar moniker that instantly created a massive corporate headache. When Logan and her father heroically rescue her from an alternate kingpin, she immediately decapitates the captive crime boss using a dropped weapon. Revealing herself as an unrepentant sociopath, she then unrepentantly seizes control of the local underworld. This hyper-violent twist aged poorly, and her profane codename became a logistical nightmare for modern executives. When eventually integrating her into wider Spider-Verse crossovers, editorial was forced to quietly sanitize her identity to simply Ashley Barton across all promotional copy and merchandise to maintain strict brand safety protocols. At number 5 is Spider-Norman of Earth-44145. Introduced in 2018's Edge of Spider-Geddon issue 4, this variant represented the absolute logical conclusion of Marvel's creative exhaustion, arbitrarily slapping the hero's visual motifs onto his greatest arch-nemesis. The corporate pitch presented a tech-augmented Norman Osborn, who ruthlessly conquered his reality as a despotic, totalitarian web-slinger. Instead, the character completely exposed the creative bankruptcy of the lazy villain swap trope. Stripped of the tragic, highly personal dynamic that typically defines the Green Goblin rivalry, this variant was written as a generic mustache-twirling megalomaniac intent on building a cosmic web to subjugate dimensions. Furthermore, his inclusion actively undermined Otto Octavius's nuanced character development, reducing complex multiversal politics into a standard, mindless punch-up. Recognizing that this antagonist was needlessly cluttering mainline titles, writers had Otto make a Faustian bargain with Mephisto specifically to gain the raw power needed to cripple Spider-Norman and hurl his broken body back through a portal to his intact home dimension just to clean up frustrating continuity bloat. At number 4 is the infamous radioactive Peter Parker of Earth-70237. Published between 2006 and 2007, Carl Andrews' Spider-Man reign was explicitly greenlit to serve as Marvel's equivalent to DC's seminal Dark Knight Returns. The Prestige format goal aimed to depict an aging, broken hero coming out of retirement within a bleak fascist future. However, the graphic novel generated intense, universal ridicule due to one catastrophic narrative decision. In Chapter 3, the protagonist confesses to a hallucination of Mary Jane that his radioactive biology slowly poisoned her over decades of marriage. This bizarre revelation that his bodily fluids bred the cancer that ultimately killed his wife turned the foundational romance of the entire franchise into a grotesque, unintentionally hilarious biological hazard. Rather than standing as an acclaimed masterpiece, the storyline became one of the most relentlessly mocked print decisions in modern publishing history, forcing executives to avoid referencing Earth-70237 for nearly 2 decades as a strict warning against unchecked creative freedom. Stay tuned as we finally uncover an absurd Wild West theme park caricature and a literal snack cake commercial turned canon. Plus, you will not want to miss our number 1 spot, where we expose the horrifying 90s alternate reality that turned Peter Parker's iconic origin into a fatal, highly contagious biological nightmare. At number 3 is Web-Slinger or Patrick O'Hara of Earth-31913. Debuting in 2018's Vault of Spiders issue 1 by writer Cullen Bunn and artist Javier Pulido, Web-Slinger was a superficial theme park pastiche conceptualized strictly to generate profitable Western-themed artwork. The concept introduced Patrick O'Hara, a Western gunslinger who wielded six-shooters loaded with chemical webbing and rode a masked horse affectionately dubbed Widow. Unfortunately, the character lacked any trace of psychological depth, emotional weight, or organic connection to the foundational theme of great power and responsibility. Instead, nearly every line of dialogue relied on strained, eye-rolling cowboy cliches, completely exposing just how staggeringly mechanical and formulaic the overarching multiverse factory had truly become. Lacking any substantive narrative hook, Web-Slinger was swiftly relegated to cluttered background battle panels across massive line-wide crossovers. He functioned exclusively as disposable cannon fodder, leaving his sole publishing legacy as a cheap visual gag cynically utilized to pad out the page counts of those oversized trade paperback comic collections. At number 2 is Golden Sponge Cake's Spider-Man of Earth-31913. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Marvel published ubiquitous full-page print advertisements where the web-slinger stopped street criminals simply by distracting them with Hostess Twinkies and fruit pies. In 2014's Spider-Verse issue 1, writer Dan Slott officially canonized this nostalgic joke dimension as an actual, tangible reality designated Earth-31914. However, bringing a vintage corporate marketing campaign into main continuity proved just how astoundingly cynical the event's stakes had actually become. In one brief segment, this beloved commercial mascot is suddenly cornered by the villainous Morlun. Instead of utilizing traditional combat tactics, the hero desperately throws golden sponge cakes at the terrifying cosmic vampire god. Unamused, the antagonist sadistically kills the mascot and drains his life force. Leveraging wholesome junk food nostalgia solely to stage a brutally graphic execution perfectly exemplified the era's worst publishing tendencies, discarding a fun concept in a matter of seconds to lazily manufacture cheap, truly forgettable multiversal filler. At number 1 is Peter Parker of Earth-9591. Conceived during the darkest depths of 90s comic edge, Earth-9591's Peter Parker debuted in the infamous Ruins miniseries as a twisted subversion of his classic origin. Instead of acquiring wondrous superhuman agility or strength, the irradiated spider bite ravages his DNA with a catastrophic, highly contagious pathogen. This version of the teenager becomes a tragic patient zero, his skin erupting in an agonizing web-shaped rash and rotting lesions. Visiting the Daily Bugle to look for freelance work, he unwittingly infects the aging photographer Phil Sheldon with a fatal mutant virus through a simple handshake. The creative execution entirely discarded the uplifting themes of great power and responsibility, swapping them out for a deeply uncomfortable exercise in pure misery porn. Serving only as a bleak visual gag to prove how horrifying a realistic comic universe would actually be, this grotesque tragedy proved completely useless to the wider mythos. Consequently, the sickening variant was permanently locked away in Marvel's vault, intentionally forgotten by modern continuity. Not every Spider-Man variant worked. Comment the worst one, subscribe now, and turn on notifications for more Marvel rankings and deep dives.